The Persephone Foundation. Timeline Archives. Timeline designation 2016-006. The War of Eastern Aggression. In December of 2016, California secedes from the Union. Their claim is backed by the idea that Hillary won the popular vote and thus actually won the election, and allegations of voter rigging in the Rust Belt states. Because the people of this timeline seem to have no sense of irony, history, or military realism, other states that voted for Clinton on the West Coast and Hawaii also secede and form the Pacific States of America. They try to get Clinton to be the president of the PSA, until someone points out that Clinton is from the East Coast, and thus cannot represent the PSA. Clinton herself remains silent on the secessionist crisis, but she does refuse to take the presidency from the hands of rebels. War begins in 2017, after PSA forces storm federal installations in California. They quickly follow up by invading Idaho, Utah, and Arizona, and successfully placing PSA governments in charge there. A surprising amount of US military defect to the PSA's side, momentarily crippling American capability to strike back, and general surprise at the hostilities prevents decisive offensives. Trump makes a call to arms, increasing the size of the Loyalist military, as the initial battles of the war go for the PSA. The PSA tries to get recognition internationally, but aside from some friendly gestures from Canada and Mexico, the international community largely ignores the PSA. The PSA's offensive eastward is finally destroyed by the forces of General Mattis in western Texas, and a steady offensive by superior American forces drives the PSA into the Pacific. The state of Jefferson secedes from the PSA. Already a hotbed of Union support, the crumbling of the Pacifican Army leads to their rebellion. A particularly brutal march to the sea ends in the siege of Los Angeles. The PSA finally surrenders in 2021. Trump's victory is short-lived. He is assassinated by actor Robert De Niro shortly after the war. The Second American Civil War destroyed America's position as a world superpower, but crises around the world meant that nobody really took her place. China and Russia were incapable of projecting their power. Russian assistance for the Union proved more the lack of Russia's capability to project power far from her borders, and the Chinese economy took a hit after its biggest trading partner decided to fight a civil war. Brexit goes through, followed by Italy leaving in 2018, and the entire Visegrad Pact leaving in 2022. France left in 2027, which ironically allowed Germany so much power that they succeeded in uniting what remained of the EU into the European Federation. The Visegrad Pact formed the Visegrad Union, eventually becoming a federation themselves. With the Americans out of the picture, the EF formed strategic alliances with Russia and the Visegrads, challenging a growing India, France, and UK. The UK, with their American allies, began to form the Anglosphere Alliance, increasing ties between these former British colonies and the young West African Union. Japanese power grows in the East, with the nation remilitarizing and defeating China and Russia in proxy wars. Turkey becomes a regional power, taking in much of America's former sphere of influence in the Middle East, and defeating Islamism with their own brand of secular autocracy. By 2070, the world teeters at the brink of war. The Chinese Communist Party fell in the Revolution of 2067, and the new Chinese Federation is an impoverished, chaotic mess that will likely break down at any time. Western powers have encroached on China, as have the Japanese. The Alliance for Freedom and Democracy is a bit of a misnomer. While the Americans, British, Canadians, Japanese, and French are definitely democratic, the Russians are not, having slipped back into a de facto czarist system. The AFD has the definite advantage in material and technology. Indeed, the EF worries about the resurgent Russian population, and theorizes that there will come a time when Russian technology outstrips that of the EF and would handily defeat it in a war. The AFD is a ramshackle thing. While Russia, America, France, and Britain got along great during the early 21st century, rivalries over Central Asia and Africa have pushed Russia, France, and Britain away from one another. It is only the resurgent threat of the EF that has drawn them back together. The Anglosphere Alliance is more or less an Anglo-American colonial venture. While India's economy is massive, its leaders are still at the beck and call of American banks. The same can be said of the South Africans and the West Africans, whose rapid ascent during the 2030s and 2040s has largely petered out. The European Federation is a de facto German empire. The national parliaments weak in the face of the European Commission and the European military. Enjoying the second largest economy on Earth, thanks to its state-of-the-art automation, the EF is no slouch. The European Space Force is second only to the United States Space Force, and they have the largest army in Europe, apart from that of Russia. The Visegrad Union is starting to fall apart, particularly as the Hungarians demand more power from the Poles. Unlike their German allies, the Visegrads are rather backwards, and will likely be more of a liability than an asset in the war. The Turkish sphere of influence, too, is crumbling, and is being encroached upon by Russia. The Turks are the sick man of Europe, and while they were supported by NATO during the Crimean crisis, now they have only EF investment to rely on. Nuclear weapons no longer guarantee world peace, as orbital and ground-based lasers have made the weapons obsolete, and nothing has come to replace them. With the assassination of the Visegrad Union's ambassador to Serbia, the time may have come for another world war. Points of interest. With the Great Wall of America crumbling and civil unrest in Mexico, the United States military has been deployed once again to put down the various criminal gangs that are occasionally crossing the border. The Cuban-American War of 2054 put an end to communist rule in Cuba. It was instigated after the destruction of an American submarine in Guantanamo Bay, which was blamed on the Cuban government. At the time, the American government was not popular among its own people, so they thought that a short, victorious war would help public opinion. The nationalist regime in Paraguay did not like the Brazilian South American project, and so resisted by helping out Uruguayan nationalists. Eventually, Uruguay, Brazil, and Argentina invaded Paraguay, starting a 6-year-long war that ended up killing large numbers of Paraguayans. Chile's heavy water processors are necessary for any modern war machine relying on nuclear fusion, and thus the Chilean government has good reason to stay neutral in any possible conflict. While Ireland left the EF and entered the Anglosphere Alliance, opinion on the EF-Anglosphere conflict still divides the Irish. Large numbers of the population still support the EU, and should war come, they may even begin an uprising to help the EF against the British. As the EU centralized and militarized, the Dutch were wary, but they stayed on with the EU regardless. Nowadays, there's a big movement to leave the EF if war were to ever break out between the EF and France. Italy's loyalties are divided between the EF and France. While officially an ally of the EF and the Visegrad Pact, Italy has stronger economic connections with France, and the AfD are promising big gains for the Italians if they join their side. To add to this mess, the Italian population wants to stay neutral in any war between the EF and the AfD. The recent assassination of the Visegrad Union's ambassador to Serbia has led to widespread panic among the Serbian people and government. Already, preparations for war are being made, and guarantees from Russia are being secured. The United Arab Republic, a new political entity under an old name. It is a secular republic created by Iran and Russia from the ruined Iraqi and Syrian states, which fell apart after the death of Assad and the Second Syrian Civil War. Greater Mauritania, another ill-conceived French project that is suffering from a separatist crisis. Cameroon is the main rival to Nigeria and is one of the most developed West African states outside of the West African Union. Considerable European investment has turned the country into a de facto colony, however. The same goes for Namibia, although it does enjoy higher standards of living than neighboring Botswana and South Africa. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia abandoned Wahhabism and the West, and went with Turkish secular autocracy. This did not go over well with many tribal leaders, who have turned against the House of Saud and their Turkish overlords. The Americans and British are exploiting this by training and arming Arabian groups to fight the government and the Turks. The Republic of Iran remains firmly under Russian control, although after the fall of the Islamic government, there was a period when that control was threatened by the Americans and the British. Now that Anglo-Russian relations have been patched up due to the resurgence of the European threat, the Anglosphere has conceded Iran to the Russians. Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires, is a Turkish ally, although it is yet to be seen if the Afghans would actually enter a war on the Turkish side. The Afghan leadership is aware that the Afghan people have suffered enough war over the centuries. The Islamic Republic of Pakistan has remained unchanged since the early 21st century, and is the only state on Earth that maintains fission weapons. Whether these century-old weapons still function is yet to be seen, but test bans have prevented the Pakistanis from trying. The Korean-Japanese War of 2061 saw the final fall of the Kim dynasty in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Backed by the Russians, the DPRK fought on for much longer than the Japanese and their South Korean allies expected, and caused major casualties. In the end, the Japanese triumphed, and their South Korean puppets succeeded in reuniting the peninsula. The Taiwan Independence War of 2050 to 2051 led to the humiliating defeat of the People's Republic of China, as the Taiwanese and their Japanese allies successfully fought the People's Liberation Army Navy to a standstill and secured Taiwanese independence. This marked the beginning of the end for the Chinese Communist Party. The Philippine-American War of 2064 saw the fall of the communist regime and the restoration of a pro-American democracy. Australia and New Zealand renewed their ties with the United States after the Second American Civil War, and, for a brief moment, were the only American allies in the world. This has been a Persephone Foundation Timeline Reading. Thank you for listening.